Hello, this is my new series and I'm going to be talking about albums that I rate. Today's album is going to be Burial's Untrue from 2007, and I'm hoping to make this a weekly series. I'm hoping to do this every Friday. I'm just going to talk about albums that I really enjoy and the sort of history behind them and why I think it's worth a listen. So Burial is an artist from South London. His real name's William Bevan. His main influences are garage, and he really grew up in that scene. In the rare interviews that he gave, he's sort of a mystic figure within the electronic scene. He talks about his brother coming home from illegal raves and parties and so on with these records that he would sit down and listen to and absorb as a young kid, and this really influenced his music later on. Now, Burial talks a lot about how by the time he became a producer and by the time he started making music, the rave scene had mostly finished. Infamously, back in the 90s, the government had banned raves and parties and large gatherings, and so really this whole scene had gone back underground. And Burial talks about how his experience of music was just going to clubs and listening to music through speakers and so on. He'd never been to a festival, he'd never been to a rave. And this really influences the melancholy that I think pervades the album as a whole. He references these moments in the past, but he can never quite live them. And this influences his worldview, and particularly his view of London. He talks a lot about how he would spend late nights driving in his car through rainy streets and really absorbing what London was like. The album was produced on SoundForge, which was a relatively primitive digital audio workstation that Burial just had his hands on. And a lot of people on the internet at the time actually called him out and said, no, you didn't create a whole album using this application, but he did. And the thing is about SoundForge is you can't grid align beats, you can't make them 1, 2, 3, 4. So he had to individually place the beats where he felt the beat would come in. And as a result, the beats that are on the album are garage influenced, obviously, but they don't feel very rigid. They feel quite loose, as if someone was drumming them, kind of, but also they feel quite chopped up. And so this gives the album this really sort of loose, kind of paranoid feeling that's unique to the project and sets it apart from other garage-based albums. The album opens up on a short untitled track and then goes into Archangel, which is probably Burial's most famous track. The song makes heavy use of Final Fantasy and Silent Hill samples. Burial was obsessed with video games and didn't have a formal sample pack to use, so he literally just lifted out samples they really enjoyed. So throughout the album there's samples from video games, there's the sound of shells hitting the floor, also in video games, there's acoustic claps, there's clicks and so on, there's the sound of rain. It's a very fluid project and it's interesting to listen to. Archangel also uses an Usher sample, but I didn't realise it was even an Usher sample until I looked it up. Archangel is a great example of how Burial can manipulate his samples to make them sound almost androgynous. He'll pitch up male vocals and he'll pitch down female vocals to give it this feel that's very human, but equally removes it from this perhaps quite charged context of an R&B song and makes it beautiful, anthemic, if you will. Burial is not afraid to use a lot of ambient music in his album. For example, in McDonald's and the end of Shell of Light are great instances of this. Really beautiful use of ambient music, and it's really emblematic of what it's like to be in a city very late at night, particularly in McDonald's. McDonald's has a very literal title. It's almost a bit trite, but in combination with this very cerebral sounding music, it actually reflects what it's like to be in a McDonald's at 4 a.m. You've got the whole range of society in there. You've got students, you've got angry men, you've got teenagers, you've got homeless people, you've got drug addicts and so on, all under this church, if you will. It's kind of artificial but also intensely human, and that kind of sums up the entire album to me. Even if you're not a big electronic music fan, I'd really recommend listening to this. It really has this songwriter feel. It takes you on a journey. The album is also very important in terms of music history. I personally love that era of music. I think it's important not just in terms of electronic music, but also indie music, because it's a very transitional stage, 2007, 2008. It's very much a point where the old guard was leaving and the sort of new influences and styles that we still see to this day were coming in, particularly after the financial crash, and particularly after smoking was banned in clubs, like inside clubs and pubs and so on. And so the way people enjoyed a night out changed as well. Untrue is important in music history because it basically takes garage as far as it will go. The album is a garage album to an extent, but it's also to an extent a dubstep album. It's also an ambient album. It really doesn't, it can't be pigeonholed exactly. I would say it's more of a very late garage album because it does use that kind of kick pattern. However, it pushes the envelope so far on this genre that it barely can even be considered that. This is definitely not a Craig David's album, for example. Its style, while it has the beat and the very vague aesthetic of garage, is so far removed from the sort of happy halcyon days of the early garage movements. It really is this sort of dark, pervasive kind of feel to it. The album cover itself sums up this. It's just Burial drinking a cup of tea, looking kind of solemn, I guess. But it just sums up the album. What would come later, and when I say later, kind of at the time, would be dubstep. And interestingly, Scream said in an interview that with early dubstep, he just viewed it as garage but not quite made right. And really with dubstep, it's turned into this whole thing associated with Skrillex and so on, this whole slowed down feel. But a lot of early dubstep was less about the beat itself and more just the shift in style from happy and bright to more darker sounding to more electronic sounding. And Burial accepted this, but still deliberately used as many human sounding samples as he could, as many human voices as he could, because he knew that people gravitated towards that, and it gives the album this melancholic feel, as I said. It's unlikely that Burial is going to release another album. He may well do, but it seems like his focus now has shifted more towards making, I say standard as if it's kind of dismissive, it's not entirely dismissive, but more standard house and techno kind of music. There are still some really interesting tunes that he makes, like Loner and so on, but really his style has shifted, and I think he's less interested in creating these sort of more cerebral sounding albums. So really, Untrue stands by itself. It's unique, and I'd recommend it to anyone. It still sounds so fresh today. Last night I just laid in my room and listened to it quite loudly, and it was raining outside, and it's just perfect. It was really an experience. So I hope you can listen to this album, enjoy it as much as I did, and yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe, and see you next Friday.